The shift did not arrive with headlines. It did not announce itself with emergency summits or televised declarations. It moved quietly through procurement contracts, revised customs codes, altered shipping routes, and reclassified energy dependencies. And yet the weight of it is already pressing against the architecture of European trade. Most observers are watching the theater. Elections, sanctions packages, military exercises, diplomatic speeches carefully staged for domestic audiences. But theater is noise. Trade is structure. And structure moves differently. There is an ignored signal embedded in recent geopolitical developments, one that does not scream, but settles. Like gravity. Like foundation cracks that widen without sound. European trade is not simply reacting to global instability. It is being reshaped by forces that are hidden, unspoken, and increasingly structural. The assumption most analysts still carry is that Europe's trade system is resilient by design, that temporary shocks, energy crises, regional wars, supply chain bottlenecks are cyclical disruptions within a fundamentally stable architecture. That assumption no longer holds, because what we are witnessing is not volatility, it is reconfiguration, and reconfiguration is irreversible. Behind the scenes, procurement flows are adjusting toward trusted corridors. Strategic reserves are being recalibrated. Export controls are being normalized. Industrial subsidies are being quietly rewritten under national security justifications. This is not protectionism in the classical sense. It is strategic insulation. There is a difference. Protectionism is defensive and reactive. Strategic insulation is anticipatory. It assumes fracture before fracture becomes visible. And when systems begin insulating themselves preemptively, it means internal confidence has already eroded. The buried data tells the story. Trade with key partners is not collapsing in headline terms. Totals remain superficially stable, but composition is shifting. Inputs are being rerouted. Dependencies are being masked rather than eliminated. Payment channels are being diversified. Settlement currencies are being hedged against political risk. When financial plumbing changes, geopolitics has already advanced to its next stage. What no one is saying openly is that European trade sits at the intersection of three accelerating forces: energy insecurity, technological bifurcation, strategic distrust within alliances. Each of these forces alone is manageable. Together, they bend the entire structure. Consider energy. The public narrative frames Europe's energy transition as a moral or environmental evolution. But beneath that narrative lies a harsher truth. Energy realignment has forced Europe into longer, more expensive supply chains with narrower redundancy. LNG shipments replacing pipeline gas. Long-term contracts replacing spot flexibility. Infrastructure retrofits absorbing fiscal capacity. These are not temporary adjustments. They are structural weight increases. And weight alters balance. Now layer in technology. Semiconductor export restrictions. Dual-use technology controls. Screening mechanisms for outbound investment. These policies are presented as targeted responses. But policy velocity reveals something deeper. The frequency and scope of controls are expanding. The definition of strategic technology is widening. Compliance burdens are increasing. This is not containment rhetoric. It is system segmentation in slow motion. Europe trades most efficiently in an open system. Segmentation reduces efficiency. Reduced efficiency compounds cost. Compounded cost erodes competitiveness. This is gravity. And then there is alliance cohesion. Publicly, transatlantic cooperation appears intact. Joint communiques reaffirm solidarity. Defense spending pledges are celebrated. Institutional language remains firm. But trust does not erode in public. It erodes in procurement clauses, in tariff exemptions that do not materialize, in subsidy disputes disguised as climate policy. The suspension of trade frameworks, the friction over industrial incentives, the recalibration of supply chain localization. These are not isolated policy disagreements. They are signals of shifting priorities. And when allies begin privileging domestic resilience over integrated efficiency, The system is already entering a new phase. None of this is dramatic. That is precisely why it matters. Systemic transitions do not begin with collapse. They begin with reweighting. Shipping lanes adjust. Insurance premiums shift. Credit spreads widen subtly. Investment screens tighten. These are silent moves, and they accumulate. The dangerous assumption is that Europe's trade architecture is too mature, too diversified, too institutionally embedded to fracture meaningfully. History does not support that belief. Trade systems are not protected by maturity. They are protected by mutual dependency and shared incentives. When incentives shift, even gradually, trade corridors narrow. When corridors narrow, strategic leverage increases. When leverage increases, political negotiation becomes economic coercion by other means. Europe's model was built on open access to energy, open access to markets, and open access to capital. Each of those pillars is now conditional. Conditional access is not stability. It is probation. The financial flows reveal more than the speeches. Capital is flowing toward redundancy, not efficiency. Defense-linked industries are absorbing disproportionate investment. Strategic stockpiles are expanding quietly. Industrial policy language is shifting from competitiveness to security. These are not semantic choices. They are declarations of intent. Intent rarely announces itself directly. It embeds in regulation. It disguises itself as resilience planning. But resilience planning, when widespread, signals anticipated stress. The most unsettling element is not any single policy. It is synchronization, energy diversification, supply chain reshoring, export control alignment, defense integration, individually manageable, collectively transformative. European trade is being repositioned from a system optimized for globalization to one optimized for geopolitical friction. That transformation carries cost. It also carries permanence. The visible world will continue to debate elections, leaders, summits. But the structural world, the one that determines trade gravity, is shifting underneath. And once structural gravity changes, reversal becomes nearly impossible. This investigation is not about crisis. It is about architecture. It is about identifying the weight distribution inside Europe's trade system and recognizing where that weight has already shifted. Because the data does not describe a temporary disturbance. It describes recalibration. And recalibration, once complete, defines the next era. What follows is not speculation. It is forensic examination of patterns already in motion. The signals are there. They are hidden in plain sight. And they are heavier than they appear. What the data says the data does not announce itself loudly. It accumulates. European trade volumes, taken at face value, still suggest continuity. Aggregate exports remain resilient. Import totals fluctuate, but not catastrophically. On the surface, stability appears intact. But totals are the least useful metric in a structural shift. Composition matters more than quantity. When we examine trade data at the level of inputs, corridors, counterparties, and settlement mechanisms, a different picture emerges, one that is largely ignored, often unspoken, and deliberately kept behind the scenes. European imports of critical raw materials have not declined, they have concentrated. Fewer suppliers, longer contracts, reduced spot market exposure. This is not diversification. It is dependency management. Energy flows reveal the same pattern. Pipeline dependency was replaced by maritime dependency. Geographic risk was traded for logistical risk. Price volatility was exchanged for contract rigidity. In statistical terms, Europe reduced variance in one dimension by increasing it in another. That is not resilience. It is reweighting. Shipping data reinforces this shift. Freight insurance premiums on specific corridors have quietly risen. Not enough to trigger headlines, but enough to alter cost structures. Port throughput has shifted eastward and southward, bypassing historically efficient hubs in favor of politically safer routes. The buried data shows a subtle retreat from efficiency toward control. Financial settlement tells an even clearer story. Euro-denominated trade remains dominant within Europe, but external settlements increasingly involve hedging layers, currency swaps, intermediary clearing, and legal contingencies that did not exist 5 years ago. These mechanisms are not added casually. They are expensive. They slow trade. And yet they are being adopted systematically, which tells us something critical. Speed and cost are no longer the primary optimization goals. Risk insulation is. Why this behavior is abnormal in normal economic conditions. Trade systems optimize for 3 variables: cost, speed, and scale. Risk is managed, but not prioritized above all else. What Europe is doing now violates that logic. Firms are accepting higher costs for lower exposure. Governments are encouraging redundancy over efficiency. Regulatory frameworks increasingly favor trusted origin rather than competitive pricing. This is abnormal behavior in a system that still claims to operate under free market principles. The justification offered publicly is security. But security narratives tend to exaggerate immediacy. The data suggests something slower, colder, and more structural. This is not a response to a single shock. It is preparation for prolonged friction. The abnormality becomes clearer when we examine timing. Many of these adjustments began before the most visible geopolitical escalations, before sanctions expanded, before energy crises peaked, before military posturing intensified. That timing matters. It indicates foresight rather than reaction. And foresight implies internal assessments that have not been shared publicly. What no one is saying is that European trade actors, both public and private, are behaving as if the global system will not return to baseline. That assumption is decisive. Once a system stops expecting normalization, it stops investing in reversibility. Infrastructure built for contingency rarely returns to peacetime optimization. Strategic interpretation viewed strategically. These shifts form a coherent pattern. Europe is repositioning itself within a fragmented global order, while attempting to preserve the illusion of continuity. That balancing act is delicate. On one side, Europe remains deeply embedded in transatlantic economic and security frameworks. On the other, it depends on external markets, resources, and technologies that sit outside those frameworks. The strategic signal is not alignment or defiance. It is hedging. Hedging against allies. Hedging against rivals. Hedging against its own institutional constraints. This is the silent move that defines the current phase. Export controls are a prime example. Officially, they are narrow and targeted. In practice, their scope expands through interpretation. What qualifies as dual use grows broader. Compliance thresholds tighten. Licensing delays become structural barriers. Trade slows without being stopped. That is strategic design. Sanctions regimes operate similarly. They are framed as temporary tools. But compliance systems built around them persist. Banks de-risk permanently. Insurers withdraw capacity. Logistics firms reroute indefinitely. The sanction may be lifted. The behavior remains. Strategically, Europe is attempting to reconcile 2 incompatible objectives: remaining a global trade hub while operating inside a security-first paradigm. Historically, no trade system has sustained both indefinitely. Eventually, one dominates. Who is absorbing the pressure does not distribute evenly. Large multinational firms with diversified balance sheets can absorb higher costs, regulatory friction, and logistical complexity. Small and mid-sized exporters cannot. The first layer of pressure is absorbed by SMEs, the backbone of European trade. Compliance costs rise. Financing becomes more conditional. Margins compress. The second layer hits consumers through price rigidity rather than spikes. Costs are embedded gradually. Inflation becomes structural rather than cyclical. The third layer settles into public finance. Subsidies expand to offset competitiveness loss. Strategic industries receive support. Fiscal space narrows. This pressure transfer is quiet. It does not produce immediate crisis, but it locks in future constraints. Labor markets adjust next. Strategic sectors attract capital and talent. Non-strategic sectors stagnate. productivity divergence increases within the same economy. This internal fragmentation is rarely discussed. It is hidden but measurable. Trade systems do not fail evenly. They hollow out selectively. Where the money and resources are actually going follow capital allocation, not rhetoric. Investment flows increasingly favor defense-adjacent industries, energy infrastructure, semiconductor fabrication, and critical minerals processing. These sectors absorb disproportionate funding relative to their current economic output. This is not market enthusiasm. It is strategic signaling. Governments de-risk these investments through guarantees, long-term contracts, and regulatory preference. Private capital follows protection. At the same time, capital retreats from globally exposed sectors. Logistics optimization, just-in-time manufacturing, cross-border financial services. These areas rely on frictionless systems. Friction is now assumed. Resources follow assumptions. The result is a trade system optimized for endurance rather than growth. That distinction matters. Growth systems expand reach. Endurance systems consolidate position. Europe is consolidating. Why this weakens one side and strengthens another? Fragmentation benefits actors with scale, internal markets, and centralized control. It disadvantages systems built on openness and coordination. Europe's strength was integration. Fragmentation erodes that advantage. Meanwhile, actors capable of operating parallel systems, alternative payment rails, domestic supply chains, state-backed trade corridors gain leverage. They do not need Europe to collapse. They only need Europe to slow. Trade power is relative. If Europe moves from first to second, derivative declines, slower growth, higher cost, reduced flexibility, its bargaining position weakens, even without absolute contraction. This is the strategic asymmetry. Europe bears the cost of adjustment up front. Others absorb it later or not at all. The data does not suggest imminent failure. It suggests repositioning under constraint. And constraint, once normalized, defines future options. This is not crisis economics. It is structural geopolitics. The system is still standing, but the load-bearing elements have shifted. And load-bearing elements, once moved, do not return to their original position. This moment will not be remembered for a single announcement. There was no formal declaration that the system had changed. No treaty collapse. No market crash that forced immediate recognition. Instead, the shift occurred in increments, in regulatory amendments, in procurement language, in shipping insurance adjustments, in subsidy frameworks quietly reclassified under national security exceptions. Systems rarely fail loudly at first. They fail quietly. They absorb stress. They redistribute pressure. They conceal imbalance through temporary stabilization mechanisms. Then, eventually, the concealed weight exceeds structural tolerance. What makes this period fundamentally different from previous cycles is not volatility. Europe has endured volatility before financial crises, sovereign debt instability, energy shocks, currency stress. Each time, the architecture bent but did not permanently deform. This time, the architecture itself is being modified. The old model of European trade was built on three assumptions: that energy would remain accessible at scale and cost efficiency, that global supply chains would remain politically neutral, that transatlantic alignment would override competitive friction. Those assumptions are no longer foundations. They are variables. And variables introduce conditional stability. Conditional stability behaves differently from structural stability. Structural stability absorbs shock and returns to equilibrium. Conditional stability absorbs shock and recalibrates downward. That downward recalibration is often mistaken for resilience. It is not resilience. It is adaptation under constraint. What has quietly shifted beneath the visible system is incentive alignment. Trade networks function when participants share overlapping incentives: growth, efficiency, access, scale. When incentives diverge, when security overrides efficiency, when domestic insulation overrides integration, trade networks narrow. Narrowing does not look dramatic. It looks prudent. But prudence, when universalized, creates fragmentation. Traditional safe havens within European trade architecture, diversified energy sourcing, integrated capital markets, rule-based dispute mechanisms were effective because the broader system was open. When openness becomes conditional, safety becomes relative. The euro's strength depends not only on monetary policy, but on external trust in Europe's trade fluidity. Industrial competitiveness depends not only on subsidies, but on frictionless access to external markets. Supply chain security depends not only on reshoring, but on stable geopolitical corridors. If corridors become contested, stability becomes temporary. The signals to watch are not dramatic speeches. They are procedural changes. Watch export license processing times. Watch foreign direct investment screening approvals. Watch insurance premium differentials on specific maritime routes. Watch the language of procurement contracts, particularly the substitution of efficiency with security of supply. Watch the quiet expansion of state guarantees in industries once left to market discipline. When governments guarantee sectors broadly, it indicates anticipated volatility beyond what markets alone can manage. Another signal lies in capital behavior. Insiders exit before headlines shift. They reposition through legal restructuring, cross-border asset transfers, intellectual property migration, and currency diversification. They rarely explain these moves publicly, but filings reveal them. When multinational firms create redundancy not for growth, but for contingency, they are signaling a belief that friction will intensify, not explode. Intensify. There is a difference. Explosion is visible and immediate. Intensification is cumulative and structural. The most consequential risk to European trade is not abrupt decoupling. It is slow segmentation. Segmentation reduces bargaining power gradually. It increases transaction costs quietly. It incentivizes alternative corridors elsewhere. And alternatives, once built, rarely disappear. In previous decades, globalization rewarded scale above all else. Efficiency was the dominant logic. Political risk was secondary. That hierarchy has inverted. Political risk now overrides efficiency in boardroom decisions. When political risk becomes primary, economic optimization becomes secondary. And when optimization declines, competitive position weakens, not overnight, but across cycles. Current stability should not be confused with durability. Energy markets appear calmer. Supply chains appear restored. Inflation has moderated from peaks. But these stabilizations rest on fiscal expansion, subsidy layering, and regulatory intervention. Artificial stabilization mechanisms are effective in the short term. They are expensive in the long term. They require continued political cohesion and financial capacity that, if either weakens, the artificial support withdraws. And systems supported artificially often reveal underlying fragility once that support fades. The concept to understand is protocol, not prediction. The protocol that in times of systemic transition. Survival is not about forecasting specific events. It is about recognizing structural direction and positioning within it. Protocol means observing capital flows before they crystallize into consensus. It means recognizing when legal frameworks expand beyond necessity. It means noting when emergency measures become permanent fixtures. Emergency measures that persist are no longer emergency measures. They are redefinitions. Europe's trade structure is being redefined incrementally. The redefinition favors insulation over openness, redundancy over efficiency, alignment over autonomy. These choices are understandable within a fragmented geopolitical landscape, but they are not neutral. They redistribute weight, and redistributed weight alters structural stress points. Future confirmation of the next phase will not come from more declarations or dramatic policy reversals. It will come from a sustained decline in cross-block investment without official prohibition, a normalization of export control expansion beyond high-tech sectors, a steady increase in state-backed industrial consolidation, a measurable decline in Europe's share of high-growth trade corridors. If those signals converge, the segmentation phase will be complete. At that point, reversal becomes unlikely, because infrastructure, physical, legal, financial, will have already adapted. Adapted systems resist returning to prior states. The unsettling reality is that none of this requires crisis. Systems can drift into diminished centrality without collapse. They can remain stable, prosperous even, while losing strategic gravity. Strategic gravity determines influence. Influence determines leverage. Leverage determines future optionality. Optionality is the true currency of power. When optionality narrows, dependence increases. And dependence reshapes negotiation dynamics permanently. The visible narrative will continue to emphasize unity, resilience, and coordinated response. Those narratives are not necessarily false, but they are incomplete. What they do not capture is the structural re-weighting underway. Weight shifts first. Cracks follow later. By the time cracks appear publicly, the weight has long since moved. This analysis is not a forecast of collapse. It is a record of repositioning. Europe is not failing. It is adapting to a world where trade is no longer insulated from geopolitical gravity. The question is not whether the system can endure. It is how much structural flexibility remains after insulation becomes permanent. History teaches that great trade powers rarely recognize the moment when efficiency gives way to security as the primary organizing principle. That moment feels responsible, prudent, necessary. Only later does it reveal its cost. What we are observing now is not panic. It is preparation. Preparation for prolonged friction. Preparation for contested corridors. Preparation for strategic competition that does not announce itself loudly. The hidden adjustments, the unspoken recalibrations, the quiet compliance shifts, the behind-the-scenes capital migrations, these form the real archive of this period. Headlines will fade. Summits will be forgotten. But the infrastructure built in response to this era will remain. And infrastructure defines eras. Years from now, analysts may look back and search for the moment when Europe's trade architecture began bending toward insulation. They may expect to find a crisis. They will instead find incremental policy language, subtle capital flows, and trade corridors rerouted without fanfare. They will find this phase, a phase where stability remained visible, but gravity had already changed. And once gravity changes, everything built within it adjusts accordingly. This is not a warning. It is a structural observation. The shift is underway. The architecture is recalibrating. The weight has moved. And systems do not forget where gravity settles.